Hi, I'm Kevin O'Reilly, and I'm happy to be talking to you today about critical thinking in history. I'm going to share my screen. So, this is about evaluating sources, evaluating cause and effect, and confirmation bias. So, that's what we're going to focus on today. As we go along, if you have questions, you can write them down at the end of the video. I'll be glad to answer questions. You can also get more information at criticalthinkingandhistory.com. And if you want to send me a note, you can send it to criticalthinkingandhistory@gmail.com. So easy to remember. This slide will come up again at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to be introducing the topic and then diving right into evaluating sources and then evaluating cause and effect, identifying confirmation bias, and applying critical thinking skills and traits to interpretations and also to decision making. And then we'll do question and answer afterwards. So I'm a history teacher, retired, devoted my adult career life to critical thinking and decision making and how to apply that in the classroom. So that's where my area of expertise is. You see I've won a number of awards. The fourth one down was a National Grand Prize for Economic Education for a project I did on the Industrial Revolution. So I've done uh, more than 100 workshops at schools and conferences on critical thinking and decision making, one of which was at the Army War College to about 10 Army officers, which was a little intimidating. It was on the Vietnam War. And I've published 29 books, and guess what they're on? Critical thinking and decision making in history. So, as long as I'm bragging here, I do need to tell you one downside, which is according to my sons at the bottom there, I have no useful skills that would be helpful in a zombie apocalypse. So they basically said, you go outside, run around, and get their attention so that the rest of us can escape. So, what is critical thinking? Well, Robert Ennis, reasonable assessment of statements, um, David Robert Grimes, that we test ideas and provisionally accept the ones that withstand the examination and discard the other ones. And then Richard, Paul, Linda Elder, probably recognize those names, that well-founded judgments. So all of these involve judgment, assessment, evaluation. How do we know the truth? How do we know how reliable the things we believe are? And that's what I'm going by. The simplest thing to remember as we go through this, a reasonable assessment of statements. That's what the focus is. So, how do we promote critical thinking? What does critical thinking look like in history classes? One of the focus is how do we pinpoint specific skills and traits? And how do we set up problems to teach those specific skills and sub-skills and traits? So that's what the focus is going to be. But how does this fit into the overall uh, environment of critical thinking research? So you have researchers. Again, I think I should get a point for having those names on that book cited. They the experts come up with practical strategies. They do the theory and practical strategies, and then they're applied to the subject matter professors or teachers. The focus here in this whole milieu of critical thinking is on the practical strategies. How do we do this in classrooms? So when you think about professors and teachers, they have lots of roles. In terms of instruction, there's questioning, Socratic questioning, storytelling, and then I want to focus on composers and conductors because what we're doing here is composing problems and then having students go through those. That is, writing symphonies and then having the students be playing the instruments. Except that these are a bit more complicated in that you don't know where the outcome is going to be of the discussion. The students can bring up anything in these problems. And so you have to keep rewriting the symphony, I guess. Um, Maybe it's more like jazz. Anyway, that's how the teachers fit in. So the critical thinking problems have specific critical thinking skills, as I said, targeting the skills, scholarship in history, specifically historiography, where students, historians are writing different interpretations of what happened, and then practical classroom considerations. How do you do this in a specific one? When I'm doing a workshop and teachers start asking very specific questions, what do you do when students are absent? What do you do? That sort of thing. I know this means something because they're asking very practical questions. So the um, handouts I'm going to show you are from this series of books, from the first five, because that's what I've written so far. I'm on writing the sixth one now. So these books are in process, and that's where the handouts come from. So, what are the critical thinking skills related to history and to citizenship? So, in each book, there's a guide to critical thinking. And when I was teaching, I would give the students this, they would have it in their notebook because they were going to refer to it all, all the day, all the time, maybe every day. So they needed to have it with them. So one of those areas is evaluating sources, that is evidence. And that's one, and that's about the first third of the page. Then the second one is analyzing cause and effect, which is a underappreciated important skill in history. I'm going to skip forecasting and evaluating analogies because I can't do everything, but there's handouts and targets on those skills, and then recognizing my own bias. So evaluating sources. So now we're in the first of the three areas. Um, Again, lots of people, ABC Clio, Stanford Education Group, Brown University, AP questions. Lots of people do materials on improving students' evaluation of historical sources. This is how I do it. So, how reliable is this newspaper article in the Boston Tea Party from December 20th, 1773? You give that to students, and some of them are going to go, what do I do first? So, again, if we go back to the Guide to Critical Thinking, we have the criteria there, and what they are is acronyms so that students can remember them. So, is it a primary source? So, an eyewitness. Does the person saying it have a reason to lie? Are they trying to protect something? Are there other sources supporting this? The more people that independently corroborate, the more reliable it is. And is this a private source? Because when it's private, it's more likely to be telling the truth. So the acronyms help them remember it. But these are guidelines, not straitjackets. This is like, oh no, I forgot to do step three. It has to do with thinking and giving the guidelines so that people can think more clearly. So in chess, you have guidelines of control the center of the board, develop your pieces, don't move your queen out early, and so forth. But there is no substitute for thinking. If you're about to be checkmated, you need to think it through. If I do this, he does that, that sort of thing. There's no substitute for thinking, but guidelines help students think. So if we go back to the newspaper in 1773, now we have questions with that. What's the point of view on the Tea Party? Is the author more likely to be British or American? And then PROP. So the guidelines are there. You'll see that it says up at the top, whoops, huh, it says level one, but I'll come back to that. Okay. Oh, there it is. Um, so level one are shorter, and they have so the teacher can say, "Oh, I only have 10 minutes to do this," so they can plug something in. Level one, they have more guidelines for students, so it reminds them to do PROP and lays out what they are. Level two doesn't have that, and level three is much longer and doesn't have many guidance. And to some extent, that can be good when students have done repetition of these. They can do it without the guidelines anymore. So, where do most students get their information? As you know, I'm sure Students get almost all of their information from books and articles. No, not really. If you give them an assignment to go out and research something, they are likely to go to Twitter or Instagram or the big G, Google. And as one of my colleagues said, if we don't train students on how to evaluate online sources, we are committing educational malpractice. We have to show them how to deal with that. So we've looked at PROP for historical sources. Now we're going to look at online sources. So this is an online newspaper on the problem of should we take down statues to Columbus? And it just says that it's Epoch Times, and I took a screenshot of that. That's it. So what do you think about that? And if we go to the Guide to Critical Thinking, it says that we should look at APPS. That is, what's the reputation of the author? What's the reputation of the publisher? Has this been peer reviewed? Oh, wait a minute. What does peer reviewed mean? So think about the opportunity to teach students about peer reviewed articles are generally more reliable, not completely, because somebody independently has looked at them before it gets published. So peer-reviewed matters, and this is an opportunity to teach students about that. If we had students going out of school who said, well, wait a minute, I need to see if this is peer-reviewed, like we would advance a lot in terms of citizenship. And does the article cite sources for specific arguments? So those are the criteria. And the first three of those have to do with checking outside sources against the one you have. So in a study by Stanford University, they had three groups: fact checkers, historians, and undergraduate history majors. And the fact checkers blew out the other two groups. It was surprising because they're like historians, but that's what fact checkers do. So they would get a source, and within 30 seconds to a minute, they'd be checking outside sources against that source. They knew to cut right to checking outside sources. So we need to get students to do that also. So here's one way to do it. So we give them these sort of an outline of here's some things you can do when you get a source. So number 2, type the name into Wikipedia of the source. So Epoch Times, type it into Wikipedia. Type the name into Google in quotes, and then type in funding or who's behind. Third, verify information articles you find in the target source by checking other reliable sources such as Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. Where do we get that? And fourth, use a fact checker site. So none of these by themselves is worthwhile, but all of them together, you'd be more likely to weed out sources that aren't as reliable. So if we go back to the Epoch Times article on Columbus, we could have the students go out and do that, but in a classroom activity, introducing this, you might go with just including the background. So I went and looked up background. I did what it said there in number 2. I went to Wikipedia and typed it in and found out that Epoch Times is a Chinese newspaper in favor of Falun Gong. And that might be relevant, and students might want to know that to evaluate this source. I also followed up on the founder of Falun Gong, who believes that space aliens walk the earth and are trying to take over, and that he's can walk through walls and is invisible. Maybe students would want to know that. So this is the sort of fun things that you can do with students. In the first one, I've done the work to put the background in there. Later on, you can say, here's a source. Actually, it could be just like an evaluation. And how reliable is this source, and see who does the things they've learned in class. So this is a media chart. The Advantis media chart is one of the more well-known ones. And so students would look at this. You can't see it as well, but they have the blown up one, and they would be able to access that online. On the upper category is right to left is liberal versus conservative, and then the vertical axis is how reliable it is. So if you're at the bottom, that's not very reliable, and at the top, it's pretty reliable. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal is a little bit right of center, and it's very reliable. So that's how you can read the chart. So now we're going to move to cause and effect. Again, lots of people have done things with evaluating sources, not as many with cause and effect, although many books have been written about cause and effect. And here's some of the ones that I used. The Thinking in Time one I used quite a bit on the decision-making problems that I've written. And the one on the right by Perry Weddle had a chapter on cause, and that's where I got a lot of the information from. So it has been written about, but it hasn't been applied in history as much as I think it should. So how do we teach this? Well, one way is we could explain to students about bad cause and effect. So did you know that when ice cream sales goes up, crime goes up, which is true. But of course, that's because in the summer, both ice cream sales and crimes go up. So this is a pretty famous correlation as cause fallacy. And if you did that with students, they'd be entertained, but they wouldn't have figured anything out on their own. So we want them to figure out better cause and worse cause and effect. So if we look at the Guide to Critical Thinking again, so there's the first sub-skill under cause and effect is there a good connection between the cause and the effect? So we're going to focus just on that one sub-skill, one at a time here. So good connection, we're going to look at that. What if we gave students a problem which says, which argument makes the strongest connection between the cause and the effect? And all of them have the same cause. The Battle of Saratoga was important to the Americans winning, same effect, the American Revolution. Now they have to do it based on the explanation. So there are three arguments here. Here's B and C, and each one of them with the same cause, and all of them are the same length. So students don't try and figure it out based on, oh, the longer one must be the one that does it. So they have to figure out which one focuses on the connection. By the way, this would be very helpful in their writing. Now, when they propose a cause, they go, well, I didn't explain how the cause led to the effect. So it goes in both directions. The suggested answers are a narrative, which says that argument A makes the best connection, and it explains it. But also, it does it with visual analysis with a visual key. So if there's an arrow, it's connected, and if there's a question mark, it's not connected. And you can see here for argument A that there's lots of arrows, so it connects it pretty well. Most people are visual learners. So for visual learners, they may benefit by having a visual diagram of the argument. Here we have arguments B and C, and you can see there's some question marks about whether Saratoga actually didn't explain how it was an advantage and didn't explain how the advantage led to Americans winning the war, and the same for C, that there's some question marks. Again, the visual one may help students. So if we go back to the second one, is there evidence to strengthen or weaken a proposed cause? That's the sub-skill now, and there are lessons on this. So this is a lesson from expansion, and this, if you look here, it says people relied on themselves and neighbors to prosper. The frontier made Americans more self-reliant, more democratic, that is more equal. That is from Frederick Jackson Turner, famous Turner thesis. So you've got scholarship boiled down, and then students have to figure out something. In this case, they have to figure out evidence that strengthens or weakens, because that was the second sub-skill. So there were few doctors and no hospitals in many parts of the frontier before they were settled. People relied on home remedies when someone was sick or injured. Does this strengthen or weaken? Well, this one strengthens it. Then many people who moved west took slaves with them. Well, that's not very democratic, so that one weakens. So this gets students to start thinking. Just imagine if we had a bunch of citizens who said, "Okay, here's a cause and effect, but what's the evidence that would strengthen and weaken it?" We'd be much better off. So in level one, there's 2 pieces, the ones I showed you. In level 2, there's 8 pieces. So there's a lot more, and teachers could select that one and then look at it. At the end, they can say, okay, how good is this cause and effect? So after you've looked at some other evidence, it might strengthen or weaken it. Again, that would be very helpful for everybody in terms of citizenship. Level 3 also includes did these effects occur in other frontiers? So if it changed American society and made it more democratic, what happened in other ones, on other frontiers? So in Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and Argentina. So if some of them didn't increase democracy, okay, how come? Why do some not? So that in terms of the guide to critical thinking, the sub-skill here is, was this a cause in similar cases? And this helps do a setting for U.S. history. So they're thinking of it in terms of a world context, so it has that added benefit. So the third area is identifying confirmation bias, our confirmation bias, not someone else's. So confirmation bias is people seek evidence that confirms and ignore evidence that contradicts their ideas. And it's been around for a while, since at least forever, but the people identified it for sure in the 1960s. There's been a lot written on this. I used these 2 books and some other books. These are sort of standouts about this. So we all have this tendency, because anybody in science area knows 200 years ago, like, wait a minute, even people that are well-meaning, they really wanted to find the truth. They have a tendency to sift out the things that they don't agree with and emphasize the ones they do, which is why we do double-blind experiments. We know that people, even well-meaning, they're not neutral on things. Their preconceptions influence them. So we need to do something about that. If we look down at bias, do I apply the same standards to information I like as to the information I don't like? Do I make excuses for the good guys and quickly condemn bad guys for the same behavior? So that's one. Am I being as neutral as I can be? Do I recognize my bias? And the second one is, am I quick to believe conspiracy theories? So these have to do with critical thinking traits that were pointed out by Richard Paul and other people. Here's some traits. What are my biases? I should have humility and not certainty. That goes back to reassessing things that I believe. Richard Paul identified it as critical thinking in a strong sense. This is not about winning arguments. It's about finding the truth as close as we can. So those are some traits, and this one just focuses on finding the bias. So if we go back to the Columbus one, we were looking at this as a source. But what if, before they did that, we had them do a survey, which is what I do in this lesson. So they look at these statements, 5 statements. Christopher Columbus was a great adventurer who showed great courage. So they strongly agree, disagree, doesn't matter. They do what they think. This is one, history is really great topic to do critical thinking, because most topics, students are not emotionally invested. They don't give a care who caused the War of 1812. Some of the British people might think like that, but most of the topics are not emotionally involved. This one is. People feel strongly about Columbus statues, and there's been a lot of arguments about it. So here, when we have an emotional one, slavery is another one, we can get students to think about their perspective on it and then apply it. So they do this survey, and after they do the survey and they have an idea of what they think about it in the abstract, then they go back to the source. And the question is, look back at your answer in handout 2, that was a previous handout, on your perspective, and then look again at the headline. Are you in agreement with the point of view, or do you disagree? Try your best not to let your agreement or disagreement with the point of view influence your evaluation of the article as a source. How reliable is the source? So that's how I deal with confirmation bias. In terms of conspiracy theories, there are lessons that have to do with that, and it explains at the top there what a conspiracy theory is. And then this one, letter C, is about the Illuminati. So it's a late 18th century, Americans believed that there were these Illuminati running around and that they were going to take over the government. And guess what? They didn't take over the government. So when students, as a natural course of studying history, see that there are conspiracy theories, and many of them, if not most of them, are bogus. They didn't work out the way they thought. They are going to be a little more hesitant to jump on the conspiracy bandwagon, I think. So we'll see. This one is from the colonial time period, and some people at the bottom there in Boston objected to smallpox inoculation. And in the answer key, it says that smallpox inoculation is one of the most salutary inventions in world history to increase life expectancy. So resisting is not. So this would be a normal thing they would do. It's not about COVID shots or any of that. It's just about history, but may help students to be a little more savvy about these kinds of things. So now we've done these 3 skills, 2 skills and a trait, and now applying them to interpretations and decision making. So here's an interpretation. Again, it takes a complex, it's from a book, very, very famous book on the Salem witch trials, and boils it down. This is level 1, so it tells them what the main cause is. In level 2, it doesn't tell them that, and it's longer. And now they have to decide how reliable this is. In level 1, it gives them specific questions. Is there sources on this or that? Look at sentence 3, that sort of thing. In level 2, it doesn't. And they have to apply multiple skills to this, including analogies. So this is the way that they can put into practice the skills that they've learned. So this one is a short one. There's 2 interpretations in level 1 and 3 in level 2 and 7 in level 3. So there's a lot of interpretations, and they're much longer. They run to 2 or 3 pages. So this, again, does scholarship. So on slavery, this is a famous book on slavery from the 1950s, and it boiled down to 3 or 4 paragraphs. This is very, very fascinating, based on an analogy to concentration camps. And students get this. They can't read the whole book. That it takes too long. So they get this summary of it. And then this one is even more famous. They used computers to analyze slavery and then was heavily criticized. So they would get A and B, and they would have to figure out what they think about these interpretations, where the strong and weak points are. So they'd be analyzing and evaluating based on scholarship in history. So one of the things we want to do is give students a chance for repetition. So if they're going to evaluate interpretations and use certain skills, we've seen that the Salem witch trials and slavery, I put the arrows there, but there are interpretations on the American Revolution, Constitution, which includes a famous economic interpretation of the Constitution by Charles Beard, as you saw, the Turner thesis for Expansion West, and so on. The Lusitania one is really fascinating, and so students really get into wait a minute, that can't be right. And so it's that sort of wait a minute that I think really helps. Repetition is important. You don't learn to play a musical instrument by somebody telling you once and you don't practice. You don't learn how to shoot a basketball by somebody telling you once and then you never practice. Practice, practice, practice. So on decision making, I have 13 books on U.S. history and 6 books on world history. And in there, the setup is you are X. So you're Philip II, and you have to decide whether to invade England. I'll just tell you, this is a hint. It's not a good idea. It's not going to work out. But they don't know that. Students don't know that. So they get some information and they have to decide. And then they find out what actually happens. And you have a lot of students going, oh no, why did I do that? Oh, and that's a great teacher. Experience is a great teacher. And in the process, they have to apply certain critical thinking skills like, well, this advisor says this. Who is this advisor and how much does he know? So they're evaluating sources. If we do this, this will happen. Cause and effect. Really? Is that kind of what's going to happen? So they use the same skills, but this is a whole other area which I couldn't do in 30 minutes. So we have to leave that one. But they are outlined on the website. So this is applying those skills. So in sum, critical thinking is an essential part of the study of history. It drives me crazy when people just memorize crap. Oh, list the 4 causes of World War I. Come on. Which one's more important than which? You should be evaluating those. We should target specific critical thinking skills and sub-skills, and then confronting students with critical thinking problems. Asking questions, Socratic dialogue is important. But if we're going to do critical thinking skills, we also need to have problems where the students have to figure things out. And then they need repeated practice to overlearn the skills. So again, if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer them after this is over. The website is criticalthinkingandhistory.com, and contact me, criticalthinkingandhistory@gmail.com. And thanks for watching.